Elvis's manager was soaked in sweat when he hung up the phone. "Boss, are you really thinking about canceling the tour for this woman?" he had asked. Elvis's response would change music history forever. Money can always be made, but a life is lived only once. At that moment, everyone realized he wasn't just a singer. Diana Martinez had always believed that some people were put on this earth to heal others through their gifts. As a 42-year-old registered nurse working the night shift at Memphis General Hospital, she had witnessed both the fragility and resilience of human life in ways that most people never would understand or appreciate. For over 23 years, Diana had dedicated every fiber of her being to caring for others in their most vulnerable moments. She had held the trembling hands of dying patients as they took their final breaths, celebrated with families during miraculous recoveries that defied medical explanation, and worked countless exhausting double shifts when the hospital was critically understaffed during flu seasons and emergency situations. Her colleagues throughout the hospital knew Diana as the nurse who absolutely never gave up on a patient, no matter how dire their condition appeared. She was the one who would sing softly in Spanish and English to comfort frightened children during painful procedures, who would stay past the end of her shift to sit with elderly patients who had no family visitors, and who somehow always managed to find a way to bring genuine hope into even the darkest and most desperate situations. Diana's supervisor, Margaret Chen, often said that Diana possessed something that couldn't be taught in nursing school, an intuitive understanding of how to touch not just the body, but the soul of someone who was suffering. Patients would specifically request Diana for their care, and families would seek her out for comfort during their most difficult hours. But Diana carried a beautiful secret that she had never shared with anyone at work, something that her professional colleagues would have found surprising and perhaps endearing. In her small, carefully organized apartment on the outskirts of Memphis, surrounded by well-worn medical textbooks, family photographs spanning 3 decades generations, and nursing journals, she had created what could only be described as a shrine to Elvis Presley. This wasn't the obsessive collection of a fanatic, but rather the carefully curated tribute of someone who had found genuine solace, inspiration, and spiritual strength in Elvis's music during her most challenging and emotionally demanding moments. The walls of her living room were adorned with concert posters from shows she had attended, newspaper clippings about Elvis's charitable work, and photographs of the singer that captured not just his famous charisma, but moments of genuine tenderness and vulnerability. Elvis's voice had been Diana's faithful companion through the grueling years of nursing school, when she would study late into the night, fighting exhaustion and self-doubt. His songs had provided her with emotional strength and resilience during her devastating divorce, when she thought her entire world was crumbling around her, and she questioned whether she would ever find happiness again. When her beloved mother had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with Alzheimer's disease, it was "He Touched Me" playing on endless repeat that had helped Diana find the courage and emotional strength to continue caring for others even while she was drowning in her own profound grief and sense of loss. Diana had attended exactly 3 Elvis concerts in her lifetime, and each one had been a carefully planned, almost sacred event that she had saved for over many months from her modest nurse's salary. She would spend weeks selecting her best outfit, drive for hours if necessary to reach the venue, and allow herself to be completely transported by the magic and transcendent power of live music. For those few precious hours during each concert, she wasn't Diana the nurse, who carried everyone else's pain and suffering in her heart. She was simply a woman who could lose herself completely in the pure joy and spiritual uplift that music could provide. Those concerts had become anchor points in her life, moments of pure happiness that she could return to in memory during difficult times. But 1976 had been fundamentally different from any year Diana had previously experienced. It had been the year that would test every single ounce of strength, faith, and resilience that Diana had spent decades carefully building building and cultivating through her work and personal struggles. The ordeal began with what should have been a routine mammogram that Diana had almost postponed multiple times due to her demanding and unpredictable work schedule at the hospital. As a healthcare professional, she knew the importance of regular screening, but like many people in caregiving professions, she had a tendency to prioritize everyone else's health over her own well-being. The results came back with words that no one ever wants to hear, words that Diana had delivered to countless families but never imagined hearing about her own body. "We need to do additional tests immediately. There are some irregularities that require further investigation." The subsequent weeks became an increasingly frightening blur of medical appointments with specialists, consultations with oncologists, invasive diagnostic procedures, and the gradual horrifying realization that her own body was betraying her in precisely the same way she had watched happen to so many of her patients over the years. The final diagnosis was devastating in its stark simplicity: aggressive breast cancer that had already begun to metastasize to her lymph nodes. The prognosis, delivered by Dr. James Morrison with the kind of gentle honesty that Diana had always appreciated in her medical colleagues, was heartbreakingly clear. Even with immediate and aggressive treatment, she had perhaps 6 months to live, maybe 8 if the chemotherapy proved more effective than expected. Diana approached her illness with the same methodical, thorough care and professional attention to detail that she brought to her nursing practice. She researched treatment options extensively, sought multiple second opinions from specialists across the region, consulted with friends in the medical community, and began chemotherapy treatments with the fierce determination of someone who had personally witnessed others fight similar battles against impossible odds. She maintained detailed notes about her symptoms, side effects, and responses to treatment. She asked her doctors the kinds of probing, informed questions that only someone with medical training would think to pose. She approached her illness as if it were a complex case study that she could solve through knowledge, preparation, and sheer force of will. But as the weeks slowly passed and the aggressive treatments began to take their devastating toll on her body, Diana found herself struggling with something she had never experienced before in her life: the complete and utter loss of hope. The woman who had spent her entire career inspiring others to keep fighting, to never give up, to believe in the possibility of healing and recovery, was discovering how incredibly difficult it was to maintain that same fighting spirit when the battle was intensely personal. The chemotherapy left her constantly exhausted and violently nauseous. Simple tasks like preparing meals or doing laundry became monumental challenges that required careful planning and tremendous effort. Her thick, beautiful dark hair, one of her favorite physical features, and something that patients often complimented, began falling out in large, heartbreaking clumps during her morning showers. Perhaps most devastating of all, Diana was forced to take an extended leave of absence from the nursing job that had given her life its primary meaning, purpose, and sense of identity for over 2 decades. The work that had defined who she was, that had made her feel valuable and necessary, was no longer possible given her weakened condition and compromised immune system. During those long, seemingly endless days confined to her apartment, too weak and sick to do much more than rest on her couch and try to keep down simple foods, Diana found herself turning to Elvis's music more desperately than ever before. She would lie surrounded by pillows and blankets, listening to "Bridge Over Troubled Water," "He Touched Me," or "How Great Thou Art," and struggle to find the same comfort and spiritual strength that his voice had always provided during previous difficult periods. But even Elvis's most uplifting and spiritually powerful songs couldn't completely lift the heavy, oppressive weight of knowing that her time on earth was severely limited, and that all her plans and dreams for the future had been suddenly, cruelly erased. It was during one of these particularly difficult and emotionally dark afternoons in early March that Diana saw an announcement in the Memphis Commercial Appeal that made her heart skip with something resembling excitement for the first time in months. Elvis was playing planning a major tour that would bring him back to his hometown of Memphis for 3 consecutive nights at the Mid-South Coliseum. The shows were scheduled for late May, and tickets would go on sale the following week. For the first time since her diagnosis, Diana felt a genuine spark of something that might be called hope or anticipation. She realized with startling clarity that she needed to see Elvis perform live one more time before she died. Not just as a devoted fan seeking entertainment or nostalgia, but as someone who desperately wanted to experience the joy, transcendence, and spiritual connection that his music had always provided during her darkest and most challenging moments. However, Diana's financial situation had become increasingly precarious since her diagnosis. The mounting medical bills were overwhelming despite her health insurance, and her disability payments covered only a small fraction of her usual income. The cost of a good ticket to see Elvis, especially for someone who wanted to be close enough to truly see his expressions and feel genuinely connected to the music, was far beyond what she could realistically afford in her current circumstances. But Diana had learned something profoundly important during her many years as a nurse working with patients facing terminal diagnoses. Sometimes you absolutely must take extraordinary steps to find hope and meaning when everything seems lost. She began systematically selling some of her most treasured possessions, jewelry that had been gifts from her late mother, furniture pieces that held sentimental value, and even some of her precious Elvis memorabilia that she had collected over the years. The process was emotionally painful, like dismantling pieces of her own history and identity, but Diana was determined. Slowly, painfully, she managed to save enough money for a single ticket to what she knew would be her final Elvis concert. When the day finally arrived to purchase tickets, Diana was absolutely determined to be among the very first people in line, despite feeling weak and nauseated from her most recent chemotherapy session. She arrived at the Mid-South Coliseum box office before dawn, wrapped in warm blankets and carrying a large thermos of herbal tea that was one of the few things she could keep down. She waited for nearly 6 hours with other devoted Elvis fans, and despite her illness, she found herself genuinely enjoying the camaraderie and shared stories. These people understood what Elvis's music meant on a deep spiritual level. They shared memories of previous concerts, discussed their favorite songs and albums, and created the kind of genuine community that only develops among people who truly understand what music can mean to someone's soul and emotional survival. When the box office finally opened and the line began moving, Diana's heart was pounding with anxiety and anticipation. She managed to purchase a ticket for the second night of Elvis's 3-show Memphis run. It wasn't front row. Those seats cost more than she could afford, but it was close enough that she would be able to clearly see Elvis's facial expressions and feel truly connected to the performance rather than watching from a distant, impersonal vantage point. As Diana held that precious ticket in her trembling hands, she felt more genuinely hopeful and excited about the future than she had experienced since receiving her devastating diagnosis months earlier. This concert had become more than entertainment. It was her beacon of light in the darkness, something beautiful and meaningful to anticipate during her remaining weeks of life. But as the weeks slowly passed and the concert date gradually approached, Diana's medical condition began to deteriorate much more rapidly than anyone, including her oncologist, had anticipated. The aggressive nature of her cancer meant that even the strongest chemotherapy treatments were becoming increasingly less effective, and she was spending more and more time in the hospital as a patient rather than feeling strong enough to be at home. 3 weeks before the scheduled Elvis concert that had become the focal point of her remaining hopes and dreams, Diana received news that completely shattered her last vestige of optimism about the future. Her oncologist, Dr. Morrison, called her into his office for what she immediately recognized as a serious conversation based on his grave expression and careful tone. "Diana," he said said with the kind of gentle honesty that she had always appreciated in her medical colleagues. "I need to discuss some recent test results with you. The cancer has spread more extensively than we had hoped when we began treatment. The tumors are no longer responding to chemotherapy, and we need to shift our focus from curative measures to comfort care and pain management." Diana, drawing on her years of experience delivering similar news to families, asked the question with the same direct professional approach she had always used when discussing difficult diagnoses. "How much time do I have left?" Dr. Morrison paused for a moment, clearly struggling with having to deliver this news to a colleague he respected. "Based on the current rate of progression, I would estimate perhaps 2 to 3 weeks, possibly a month if we can manage your symptoms effectively and your body responds well to palliative care." Diana understood immediately and completely what this devastating news meant for her future. She would not live to see Elvis perform. The concert that had become her beacon of hope, the event that had given her something beautiful and meaningful to anticipate during her darkest days, would take place after she was gone. Her final dream, her last connection to something that had brought her joy throughout her life, was being taken away by the relentless progression of her disease. That evening, alone in her sterile hospital room, with only the distant sounds of medical equipment and occasional footsteps in the hallway, Diana cried harder than she had at any point since receiving her original diagnosis. She wept not just for her approaching death, which she had gradually come to accept, but for the crushing realization that she would never again experience the transcendent joy that Elvis's music had always brought to her life. She would never feel that powerful connection to something larger than herself, never lose herself in the magic of live performance one final time, never have the opportunity to say goodbye to the music that had sustained her through every major challenge and transition in her adult life. It was Diana's younger sister Maria who ultimately made the phone call that would change everything. Maria, a dedicated high school English teacher who had watched her sister's decline with growing desperation and helplessness, simply could not bear the thought of Diana dying without experiencing that final moment of joy and connection that meant so much to her. Maria had no realistic idea how to reach Elvis Presley or anyone in his organization. She was an educator with absolutely no connections to the entertainment industry, no insider knowledge about how celebrity contact worked, and no experience with anything beyond the normal channels of buying concert tickets and listening to music on the radio. But Maria was also a woman who had inherited the same fierce determination that had made her sister such an effective nurse. She was not going to let Diana's final wish go unfulfilled without exhausting every possible avenue for making contact with Elvis or his representatives. Maria began her campaign by calling the Mid-South Coliseum directly, carefully explaining Diana's medical situation to anyone who would listen with patience and compassion. She spoke to ticket office representatives, event coordinators, security personnel, and facility managers. Most people were genuinely sympathetic to Diana's situation and moved by the love they heard in Maria's voice, but they explained that they had no direct way to contact Elvis personally and no authority to make special arrangements. Undeterred by these initial disappointments, Maria expanded her efforts systematically. She began calling radio stations throughout the Memphis area, explaining Diana's story to disc jockeys, program directors, and station managers. She contacted newspaper entertainment editors, hoping that someone might have connections to Elvis's organization or might be interested in writing about Diana's situation. She even called RCA Records, Elvis's label, and attempted to work her way through their corporate hierarchy to reach someone who might have access to Elvis or his management team. Most of these calls led nowhere. nowhere productive, but Maria's persistence and the genuine love and desperation in her voice, when she spoke about her dying sister, began to make a memorable impression on some of the people she contacted. Finally, after dozens of phone calls and countless disappointments, Maria's effort reached someone who had the potential to make a difference. A radio DJ at WHBQ, a station that was well known for its strong connection to Elvis and Memphis music history, was deeply moved by Diana's story when Maria called during a slow afternoon. The DJ, whose name was Robert Bobby Klein, had been working in Memphis radio for over 15 years and had developed relationships with many people in the local music industry. He had recently conducted an interview with someone from Elvis's management organization for a story about the upcoming concerts, and he decided to take the unusual step of passing along Maria's message. Bobby called the contact number he had for Elvis's organization and specifically asked to speak with someone who could handle special requests or unusual situations. He explained that he had received a call about a dying nurse who was a devoted Elvis fan, and he felt that the story was compelling enough to warrant attention from someone with decision-making authority. That phone call made its way through several layers of Elvis's complex organizational structure before finally reaching Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's longtime manager and the person who controlled virtually all access to the performer. Parker was known throughout the entertainment industry for being primarily focused on business matters, financial considerations, and carefully controlling access to Elvis to maximize commercial opportunities. Colonel Parker received dozens of similar requests every week from fans with various needs, circumstances, and sob stories. His standard policy was to politely decline such requests, explaining that Elvis's schedule and security requirements made personal meetings impossible. He had learned over the years that accommodating one request would inevitably lead to hundreds of others, creating an unmanageable situation. But something about Diana's story resonated differently with Parker, though he couldn't initially identify exactly what made this situation feel unique. Perhaps it was because Diana was a healthcare worker who had dedicated her entire career to helping others, rather than simply a fan seeking a personal thrill. Perhaps it was the specific timing. Elvis himself had been struggling with his own serious health issues recently, and had become increasingly reflective about mortality, legacy, and the meaning of his career. Or perhaps it was simply that Diana's genuine, decades-long love for Elvis's music, combined with her approaching death and the modest nature of her final request, created a story that demanded serious consideration rather than automatic dismissal. After thinking about the situation for several hours and discussing it with a few trusted advisors, Parker made an unusual decision. He decided to bring the matter directly to Elvis's attention, rather than handling it himself or delegating it to a subordinate. He found Elvis at Graceland, in the music room where he often spent time when he was working on arrangements or simply relaxing with his music. Elvis was sitting at his piano, reviewing set lists and working with some of his band members on arrangements for new songs they planned to include in the upcoming Memphis concerts. The room was filled with the comfortable chaos of creative work, sheet music scattered across surfaces, guitars propped against chairs, and the easy camaraderie of musicians who had worked together for years. Elvis, Colonel Parker began, settling into a comfortable chair near the piano. "I've got something a bit unusual here that I think you should hear about personally." Elvis stopped playing and looked up with the kind of intense, focused attention he always gave to matters involving his fans or anything that Parker felt was important enough to bring to him directly. "What's going on, Colonel?" Parker explained everything he had learned about Diana's situation, her career as a dedicated nurse, her years of devotion to Elvis's music, her current battle with terminal cancer, and the heartbreaking reality that she would not live to see the scheduled concert that had become her final source of hope and anticipation. He mentioned how Diana had sold her personal possessions to afford a ticket, how Elvis's music had sustained her through previous difficult periods in her life, and how her sister was desperately trying to find a way to grant Diana's final wish for one last direct connection to the music that meant so much to her. Elvis listened in complete, absorbed silence, his expression growing more thoughtful and emotionally engaged with each detail of Diana's story. When Parker finished speaking, Elvis stood up from the piano bench and walked slowly to the large windows that overlooked Graceland's beautifully maintained grounds. He stood there for several long minutes, his hands clasped behind his back, obviously thinking deeply about what he had just heard. The room remained quiet, with even the band members sensing that something significant was being considered. "Colonel," Elvis finally said, turning back to face his manager with an expression that combined determination with deep emotional conviction, "I want you to call Diana's sister back immediately. Tell her that I'm going to visit Diana personally, and I want to perform for her privately before her condition gets any worse." Colonel Parker was genuinely stunned by this response. While Elvis was certainly known for his generosity toward fans and his willingness to help people in need, this was an unprecedented request that would have major implications for his schedule and security arrangements. "Elvis, son," Parker said carefully, "you realize this would mean completely rearranging your entire schedule for the next week? You've got essential rehearsals for the tour, recording sessions that have been planned for months, and numerous media commitments leading up to the Memphis concerts. The financial implications alone." "Then we'll rearrange everything," Elvis replied with the quiet but absolute determination that those closest to him recognized as completely non-negotiable. "Colonel, I've been thinking a lot lately about what really matters in life, about what my music is supposed to mean and accomplish. I've got money, fame, more success than any person could reasonably need. But what's the point of any of it if I can't use it to help someone when it truly counts?" Elvis paused, looking directly at his manager with an expression that was both vulnerable and absolutely resolute. "This woman has spent her whole adult life taking care of other people, probably saving lives and bringing comfort to families during their worst moments. She's facing death herself now, and her one last wish is connected to music, to something I can actually give her. How could I possibly say no to that?" Colonel Parker realized that Elvis had made up his mind completely, and that no amount of practical argument about schedules or financial considerations would change his decision. While he still had serious concerns about the logistical implications and the precedent this might set, he also recognized the depth of Elvis's emotional conviction and the spiritual importance this clearly held for him. "What exactly are you proposing, Elvis?" Parker asked, already mentally beginning to calculate what would need to be rearranged. "I want to visit her personally at her home or wherever she's most comfortable," Elvis said with growing certainty about his plan. "I want to sit with her, talk with her about her life and her work, and sing for her, whatever song she wants to hear, whatever would bring her the most joy and comfort. And I want to do it as soon as possible while she's still strong enough to truly enjoy it." Parker nodded slowly, understanding that this was much more than just a fan visit or a publicity opportunity. This was Elvis responding to what he clearly saw as a spiritual calling. "And what about all the tour preparation, the rehearsals that are scheduled, the recording sessions?" Elvis's response would become the moment that defined not just this particular story, but his entire evolving understanding of his purpose and responsibility as an artist with the power to touch people's lives. "Colonel," Elvis said with a clarity and conviction that surprised everyone in the room, "I've been performing for crowds my whole career, and I'll have many more opportunities to do that. But sometimes the most important performance is for an audience of one person who really needs it. Money can always be made, tours can always be rescheduled, but a life is lived only once. This woman is dying, and if I can bring her some joy and peace in her final days, that's more important than anything else I could be doing." The music room fell completely silent as everyone present absorbed the weight and significance of Elvis's words. Colonel Parker realized he was witnessing a moment of profound clarity and spiritual insight from an artist who had always struggled to balance his enormous commercial success with his deeper desire to use his gifts to touch individual lives in meaningful ways. "You realize," Parker said carefully, "that if word gets out about this visit, we'll inevitably have thousands of people claiming to be dying or in desperate situations, all requesting personal visits from Elvis. The logistics alone could become impossible. Elvis nodded thoughtfully. I understand the concerns, Colonel, and I know this could complicate things in the future, but I can't make decisions based on what other people might do or claim. I can only make decisions based on what I know is right in this specific situation, and visiting Diana feels absolutely right. Colonel Parker made the phone call to Maria that same afternoon, after Elvis had given him specific instructions about how to handle the conversation. When he reached Maria at the high school where she taught and explained that Elvis wanted to visit Diana personally to perform for her, Maria was initially completely speechless. She had hoped, at most, that perhaps Elvis might acknowledge Diana's situation in some small way during his scheduled concert, maybe dedicating a song to her or mentioning healthcare workers. The idea that Elvis Presley would visit her dying sister personally seemed so impossible that she wondered if this might be some kind of cruel hoax. Are you absolutely certain this is real? Maria finally managed to ask, her voice trembling with emotion. Are you sure that Elvis himself wants to do this? Parker assured her that Elvis was completely serious about the visit and asked about Diana's current condition and where she was receiving care. Maria explained that Diana had recently made the decision to return home from the hospital to spend her remaining time in familiar surroundings rather than in a clinical environment. Elvis would like to visit tomorrow afternoon, if Diana feels up to it, Parker said. He wants to bring his guitar and spend some meaningful time with her.
He's asked that this be kept completely private. No media, no photographers, just a personal visit between Elvis and Diana. Is that something she would want? Maria began crying as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Her impossible hope was about to become reality, and her sister's final dream would be fulfilled in a way that exceeded anything she had dared to imagine. She would want that more than anything else in the world, Maria managed to say through her tears. This will mean everything to her. The next afternoon, Elvis arrived at Diana's modest apartment in a quiet Memphis neighborhood with an understated approach that surprised everyone involved. He came with minimal fanfare, just himself, his acoustic guitar, and one trusted security person who remained outside to ensure privacy and handle any unexpected situations. Elvis had specifically requested that no photographers, journalists, or other media representatives be present or even informed about the visit. This was not about publicity, promotion, or image management. It was entirely about giving a dying woman a moment of pure joy and spiritual connection during her final days on Earth. Diana was resting on her living room couch, wrapped in a soft quilt that her mother had made years earlier, when she heard the gentle knock on her front door. Maria had carefully prepared her sister for the visit, but Diana still couldn't quite believe it was real until she saw Elvis Presley standing in her modest living room, guitar case in hand, with that famous warm smile and genuine compassion shining in his eyes. Diana, Elvis said, settling into a comfortable chair across from her couch. I understand you're a nurse. That means you've spent your life taking care of other people when they needed help most. Today, I'd like to take care of you. What followed was an afternoon that would be remembered by everyone who eventually heard about it as one of the most beautiful and moving examples of human compassion in music history. Elvis spent over 4 hours with Diana, talking about her life, her career in nursing, the specific challenges and rewards of healthcare work, and the profound role that music had played in sustaining her through various difficult periods. He asked thoughtful questions about her experiences as a nurse, showing genuine interest in her work and expressing deep respect for the sacrifices that healthcare workers make. He talked about his own mother's health problems and his growing appreciation for the people who dedicate their lives to caring for others during illness and vulnerability. Elvis performed many of Diana's favorite songs, carefully tailoring his selections to her specific requests and the memories they held for her. When she mentioned that "He Touched Me" had helped her through her mother's death, Elvis sang it with a tenderness and spiritual depth that brought tears
tears to both their eyes. When she talked about how Bridge Over Troubled Water had given her strength during her divorce, Elvis performed it as if he were singing directly to her wounded heart and offering personal comfort. But perhaps the most remarkable and meaningful part of the visit was not the music itself, but the extended conversation they had about mortality, faith, the fear of death, and finding meaning and purpose in the face of suffering. Elvis talked openly with Diana about his own struggles with health issues and his growing understanding that fame and commercial success meant nothing if they weren't used to help others in genuine need. "Diana," Elvis said at one point during their conversation, "you've probably saved more lives and brought more real healing to the world than I ever will. I just make music and entertain people. You've actually made people better, given them hope when they had none, comforted families during their worst moments. That's the most important work anyone can do." Diana, who had been feeling weak, discouraged, and disconnected from her sense of purpose for months, found herself feeling more alive, hopeful, and spiritually centered than she had experienced since her diagnosis. The validation from someone she admired so deeply was profoundly healing in ways that medicine couldn't address. "Elvis," she replied with growing strength in her voice, "your music has healed me and sustained me in ways that medicine never could. You've given me strength when I had none left, hope when everything seemed dark, and joy when I thought I'd never feel it again. That's its own kind of healing." As the afternoon gradually came to an end, Elvis made a spontaneous decision that surprised even him and would have lasting implications for the remainder of his career. He told Diana that he was going to dedicate his upcoming Memphis concert specifically to her and to all the healthcare workers who sacrifice so much to care for others in their communities. More importantly and dramatically, he decided that he wanted to postpone the entire tour so that he could spend more time visiting with patients at Memphis hospitals and other healthcare facilities throughout the region. "Music should be medicine," Elvis told Diana as he prepared to leave her apartment. "If I can't use my gifts to heal people and bring them comfort when they need it most, then what's the point of having these gifts in the first place?" Diana lived for 6 more weeks after Elvis's transformative visit to her home. During that precious time, Elvis visited her twice more, bringing his guitar each time and continuing their conversations about life, death, purpose, and the healing power of human connection expressed through music. But perhaps even more significantly, Elvis also began an extensive series of hospital visits throughout Memphis that would continue for the remainder of his life and fundamentally change how he understood his role as an entertainer. He quietly performed for cancer patients, children with chronic illnesses, elderly patients in long-term care, and anyone else who could benefit from the healing power of music delivered with genuine love and compassion. The tour that Elvis postponed was eventually rescheduled for later that year, but it was completely different from any tour he had ever undertaken. He included hospital visits in every city, meeting with patients and families affected by serious illness. He dedicated every single show to healthcare workers and their patients, and he established a foundation to support medical research and to provide music therapy programs in hospitals across the country. Diana's sister Maria later said that the final weeks of Diana's life were filled with more joy, peace, and spiritual fulfillment than anyone had thought possible given her medical condition. Diana talked constantly about her afternoon with Elvis, not just because she had met her idol and heard him perform personally, but because she had experienced a level of human compassion and genuine connection that reminded her of everything beautiful and meaningful about life. When Diana finally passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by family, Elvis attended her funeral service. He sang "Amazing Grace" for the small gathering of family and friends, and he spoke movingly about how Diana had taught him that the most important audience for any performer is always the one that needs healing the most. The impact of Diana's story extended far beyond her own life and death. Word of Elvis's extraordinary compassion spread throughout the medical community and inspired other entertainers to consider how they might use their platforms and talents for healing rather than just entertainment. Hospitals began incorporating integrating music therapy programs into their treatment protocols, and the revolutionary idea that entertainment could be medicine became widely accepted within healthcare circles. Elvis's decision to prioritize one woman's dying wish over commercial commitments became a defining moment in his career and personal evolution. It demonstrated that true artistry involves not just talent and commercial success, but the wisdom to understand when and how to use that talent for the greatest possible good. Years later, when people asked about the most important performance of Elvis's career, those who knew Diana's story would point not to any of his famous concerts or television appearances, but to that quiet afternoon in a small Memphis apartment where a dying nurse experienced the healing power of music, delivered with perfect love and understanding. Diana Martinez's legacy lived on not just in the lives she had saved and the comfort she had provided as a nurse, but in the profound transformation she inspired in one of the world's most famous entertainers. She had shown Elvis that sometimes the greatest act a performer can undertake is to step away from the spotlight and shine that light directly into one person's darkness, offering hope and healing when it's needed most. The story became a powerful reminder that in a world increasingly focused on fame, fortune, and commercial success, the most meaningful and lasting moments often happen in quiet spaces between public performances, where one human being chooses to use their gifts selflessly to ease another's suffering and bring light into darkness. Elvis's words that day, "Money can always be made, but a life is lived only once," became much more than just a justification for postponing a lucrative tour. They became a guiding philosophy that influenced the remainder of his career and inspired countless others to consider how they might use their own talents, however modest, to bring healing and hope to those who need it most. In the end, Diana's story proved that sometimes the most powerful and important performance is not the one that entertains thousands of people, but the one that heals a single heart and reminds us all of our capacity for compassion. And sometimes, the greatest gift a fan can give their idol is the opportunity to discover the true purpose and meaning of their gift.